So just to say hello from us, first of all, I'll introduce myself and then I'll hand over to Gemma. So my name's Emily Bennett. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist and paediatric neuropsychologist, and I work in the children's neuro rehab team at Nottingham Children's Hospital. We're called the BRIL team, which stands for Brain Injury Living Life. I'm also the chair for the National ABI in Learning and Education Syndicate, which we'll tell you a little bit about in a second. Gemma.
And I'm Gemma Costello. I'm an educational psychologist in paediatric neuropsychology. I'm the clinical lead at the Cambridge Centre for Paediatric Neuropsychological Rehabilitation, which is CCPNR for short. We provide community rehabilitation services to children and young people from 0 to 19 across the east of England. And I'm also a member of the Enable Steering Committee.
Okay, I'm hoping that's moved on. Has that moved, Gemma?
Yeah, got it. So we're just going to do a bit of an overview just to start you off, just to give you a bit of context about what we're going to be doing in the short time that we have with you today. It really is a whistle-stop tour. So please, if you've got questions, feel free to kind of pop them into the chats and things, and then we'll try and save some time at the end to respond to anything. If we can just about keep to our times, we should be there. So we're going to talk a little bit about brain development and an introduction to acquired brain injury. We're going to think about that return to school after acquired brain injury, acknowledging both the challenges but also what works well. We're going to think about elements of pathways and best practice. Most importantly, supporting acquired brain injury, recognising it in the classroom and exploring some of the interventions that work. And then an overall summary with some hopefully kind of helpful links and signposting if you'd like to find out any more. So Enables, the National Acquired Brain Injury Learning and Education Syndicate. We were founded in 2018 off the back of the recommendations from the Time for Change report, the details of which can be looked at the UK Acquired Brain Injury Forum, which is essentially kind of setting out kind of a strategic direction for what acquired brain injury services should look like across the UK. Our aims really and vision for Enables is that children and young people with acquired brain injury should have access to the support that they need in order to maximise their participation and their potential in education. So the priority, I guess, aims of the group of Enables are to raise awareness of acquired brain injury within the education system, to think about how we can influence and drive that change for children and young people to have a smoother journey throughout their educational experience, to lobby for that change within government, to identify and share what we know to be good practice, most importantly, to develop and consult with advisory groups, of which we have a Young Experts by Experience advisory group, who are really kind of leading the way and directing the work that we do as a committee. And then to also collaborate on acquired brain injury research projects, thinking about where there's gaps in the evidence and what might work and be most effective in schools in the longer term. So the work so far has consisted of a range of things. We've met with the Department for Education, the DHSC. We've met with a number of education ministers who seem to have changed a fair few times in the time that we've been doing this. We've had involvement with a range of organisations. We're very grateful to Twinkl to be able to be here today. NASEN, Whole School Send, the Senko Award. We've developed things such as videos, short videos. They're kind of 10 to 15 minute videos for NQTs, which is part of the condition specific series. You can find that on YouTube. It's a great, helpful watch as an introductory to acquired brain injury, following the experience of a young person, and is fab if you're just looking for something for a quick staff meeting. In terms of, we have a range of regular articles, all of which can be found on our websites, but I guess the main thing is how we've been kind of briefing, bringing in kind of questions for parliamentary debate, and to kind of, and Chris Bryant has been a huge kind of advocate of acquired brain injury for us. And then there's been the kind of development of our young people advisory group, and we are intending to have a professionals group in the future, and really to then think about this development of best practice guidance, which we're going to talk to you a little bit about during the session today. So before we start and kind of get into that next phase, we just wanted to do a quick poll, just because it's really helpful to us, and you've got 2 of them that have just been launched. The first one is to think about how confident you would feel supporting a young person with acquired brain injury in your setting. So either strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, or strongly agree. So if you'd be happy just to answer that for us, that would be really helpful. And then the second question that we've got for you is, do you think your outcomes would be better or improved if you have your acquired brain injury as an adult or as a child? We'll just give you a minute just to answer those polls before I hand over to Emily. Thank you.
Okay. We good to move on, or are we still getting, I can't see the screen.
I think it looks like we're good to move on.
Brilliant. Okay. So what we wanted to do today was to give you a little bit of a potted guide to things that it's really important to remember about brain development when we're thinking about the context of brain injury. And there's a few kind of, quick facts that if you go away remembering after today, we'd be very pleased to think that teachers and others working in education are very aware of. So the first thing that we always tell people and like to remind people is that children's brains aren't the same as adults. They are not mini adults, and their brains are very much a work in progress. So our brains are developing all the way through when we're kind of conceived through until we're about 25. So we have a really protracted kind of developmental trajectory. We have 100 billion neurons in our brains, and in utero, these are developing at about 250,000 per minute. So the development of the brain when children are very small is very, very rapid. That continues after birth, and the first 5 years see huge development. And we notice that, don't we, when we see young children suddenly developing language, they're learning all sorts of motor skills, and other things are coming online very, very quickly in those early years. What we also know, though, is that there are different parts of the brain that are developing at different phases and different stages across that developmental time. So while we see those rapid developments perhaps in language and the sensory pathways and so on very early on, the higher cognitive functions, our executive functions, and the parts of our skills and learning that are controlled much more by our frontal lobe is developing later. Our brains develop from the back to the front. So all the way through to 25, we're still seeing brain development happening across that frontal lobe. And this is really important, as we'll talk about later, because when we have a brain injury in childhood, that can mean that the brain injury looks different at different times. So as a child's brain develops, what we find is that their brain starts to specialize. So different parts of the brain take on different responsibilities. And in an adult's brain, if an adult has a brain injury, we can fairly clearly say that we can anticipate what the results of that brain injury might be. So damage to a certain part of the brain that is linked to language, for example, in an adult might look, so they may appear to have expressive aphasia, or they may struggle to understand language and so on. In a child, that looks quite different because the brain is less specialized. What we often see is much broader areas of difficulty. So we see network type difficulties around attention, processing speed, and other sort of parts. The brain is using those different parts differently. So the brain is specializing as it develops, and the children are recruiting different parts of their brain when they're younger to the parts of the brain that they will then use as an adult or an older child. And that's really important, again, because we sometimes see that late emerging effect of a brain injury. The other thing that's developing across childhood is the white matter and the networks within the brain. And this is a bit like a road system that's being built. So all of those 100 billion neurons that you have in your brain are desperate to make connections with other neurons. So what we see over time is the development of these pathways and really clear networks that are passing information very effectively throughout the different parts of the brain. Obviously, when there's some kind of injury to that network, we can see disruption, and that again is something that's really important to hold in mind. So what we want to think about always is what could be the disruption that's happened as a result of an injury, and where does that place that child when we think about their development. I think the other thing that we always talk about to teachers is that much of the development that's happening within the brain across childhood, adolescence and into early adulthood is innate, and it's going to happen. It's coming online, things are happening anyway. But experience and environment really matter as well. And this can really impact on the way that the pathways in our brain are formed. So we're regularly thinking about how we're building those brains and helping the brain to build in a really positive way. So in terms of then thinking about acquired brain injury, or ABI, an acquired brain injury is an injury to the brain that happens following a period of normal development. So it can happen to any child or adult at any age, but we would usually have seen a period of what would be referred to for that child as normal or expected development. Brain injuries can include traumatic injuries, so things like falls, assaults, accidents, but it also includes illnesses, infections and other conditions such as stroke, brain tumours, and then things like infections or abscesses to the brain. Acquired brain injuries range from mild all the way through to very severe. So a mild traumatic brain injury would be a concussion, but we also see those very severe brain injuries that have a very long-term and lasting impact on the child. It's estimated that around 40,000 children a year are seen in hospital with an acquired brain injury. That's a figure from the NHS, but we know for lots of reasons that that's likely to be a huge underestimate. So there are likely to be a lot more children out there who are experiencing brain injuries. From that number, we know that around 2,000 of those will have had what's classed as a severe brain injury. There will be about 3,000 who have moderate injuries and about 30,000 who have those concussions or mild TBIs. And there's around 5,000 others who have an ABI as a result of an illness or infection. So these are really quite big numbers. And when we look at that number and we crunch those figures kind of across the time that a child would spend in the classroom from 5 through to 16, that equates to about one child per class who will have some sort of brain injury by the time that class would complete their education. So these are really big numbers. And I think what teachers tell us a lot is that they don't feel that they may have worked with a child with a brain injury, or they may not have children with brain injuries in their schools. But actually, I think sometimes that's because those brain injuries haven't been recognised or happened historically and haven't then been talked about. So there will be children in your classrooms and in your schools who do have brain injuries. What we also know about that figure, and this is really relevant for schools who work, are based in socially deprived areas, is that we think that figure is about 5 times higher. So there are a lot of children in those socioeconomically deprived areas that are struggling with a brain injury. So in terms of the kinds of difficulties that we see after brain injury, the brain controls everything we do. And so the impact of a brain injury can happen across all areas of function. And I think that's really important to hold in mind. So when we talk about the SEND code of practice and the broad areas of need, we see difficulties after brain injury happening in all of those broad areas. So children can struggle with cognition. They have difficulties around executive function, processing speed, memory, and so on. They also struggle from a behaviour and emotional perspective. They have difficulties sometimes with motor skills and sensory skills after brain injury. And there's also an impact often on communication and social skills and so on. So the impact of a brain injury can be really, really broad. And all of that is also additionally affected by post-acquired brain injury fatigue, which we'll talk more about later. So as I was saying earlier, I think that the message that we really want you to think about is that the brain keeps developing across childhood. So we know that there is maturation that's happening until about 25 years. What that means is that if there is damage to the brain during childhood, this can have a really significant impact on future growth and development. So you can see in the graph there that we've got a normal trajectory that's happening and a trajectory in purple where there's been an acquired brain injury of some kind. What we then see is that, hopefully over time, the child has plasticity in their brain and they do show quite a lot of recovery in many ways. So many of the children that I work with will walk out of hospital, they will look much as they did before, and they will make a really good recovery on lots of levels. However, we also see that their trajectory has been changed by this brain injury. And actually what can happen over time is firstly, the gaps can get bigger between them and their peers because they are now trying to continue that brain development with an element of damage to the brain cells. But also, as new skills should be coming online and new parts of the brain should be recruited over time, we may see that there's a difference in the sorts of difficulties that we see as those parts of the brain that perhaps were damaged aren't recruited successfully. So we can see a worsening or new difficulties appearing as the brain develops throughout childhood and adolescence. A particular example of that would be a child who perhaps has an injury to the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe, as I said, is the latest developing part of the brain. So when that child is 8 and they're in quite a sort of nurturing small primary school, we don't put too many demands on children at that point in terms of executive function and those higher level cognitive skills. So we may not notice that that child is struggling. However, when they get to secondary school, the brain injury can look very different. All of a sudden, the environment is much more demanding, but also the part of the brain that had that damage early on is now needed for completing those sorts of tasks. So organising, planning, problem solving, dealing with the complex social situations that teenagers find themselves in. And what we find is that this young person is now trying to deal with that with damage to that area of the brain. So we notice those difficulties much more at that point, and it then becomes something that can become challenging in the classroom. And with that in mind, what we always say is that, you know, we're thinking all the time about making sure information's passed on, planning for the future and monitoring over time, and really thinking about those key transitions and how we can support that effectively. Gemma, over to you.
Okay. So I think, you know, we're going to spend time just thinking very briefly about the return to education after an acquired brain injury. And I think the important thing that, you know, Emily and I want to acknowledge as well here is that we know that this is quite challenging, and the evidence base tells us that it's challenging and that it's not easy. Schools are really crucial in this, in terms of the sense that you provide this environment every day where young people are learning, and essentially, you know, when we get that support right, these children are adapting and finding new ways to be able to do things, to kind of use that plasticity that we have within our brain to make new connections and new pathways. And so it's so important. But one of the reasons that we know it's really challenging is because there's very little training out there for teachers and educators around acquired brain injury in initial teacher training or in terms of any ongoing CPD. And so that understanding of it as a need is less. We know that there's very few pathways as well to support the processes. There can sometimes be really challenging kind of communication between getting the right people in the room to have the conversations about that young person and how they're doing following this very sudden event. Also, everybody, you know, if a young person's had an acquired brain injury, they are quite sudden events. And so there's the milder ones that we might not know about. And so we might not know to have the conversations about them. And then those where there's the more severe injuries, there's the support that's needed to the staff, to the young people, to their friends, to the family, as there's a lot of processing that happens at that time. So we appreciate that this is a very challenging time for not only the young person, their family, but for the school and their community as a whole. And I guess the other thing that we need to acknowledge is that the SEND system, by its very nature and the way that the funding is designed, doesn't always allow for a quick response to newly acquired needs. It's set up very much with a developmental model and framework. And that brings about a challenge in terms of being able to expedite and put into place plans and support for a young person that needs to be both immediate and then quite dynamic in terms of its response. So the challenges for children and young people when they're returning within school, we feel like, you know, many of our children and young people will be, you know, in an environment that they're very familiar with. They return to their classrooms, they're with their peers, they're with teachers they know well, they're accessing content and material that they've known. There's a familiarity to their day. But yet something may just suddenly feel very different, very altered, not quite the same. And they're having to, in those moments, continuously adjust to those new experiences, both cognitively, socially, but then also emotionally as well. So it can be little things like kind of keeping up with the pace of conversation with your peers, being able to kind of follow a multi-step instruction in the classroom. keeping up with the pace of the number of activities that everybody else is doing, or simply just understanding some of the vocabulary that before or previously might have been very familiar to you. And one of the challenges, I think, for many of our young people is that these cognitive needs, as Emily said earlier, can be both cumulative. So they can young people can have quite a spiky profile. They still have all of this previous experience of learning, their typical development for them, for their brain. And so they still present with many strengths and skills that's in line with all that previous history of learning that they've had. And then there's this kind of sense then around, well, what's new learning like? And how do I take that on? And how do I absorb that? And it can be really hard to see. Because as Emily said, many of our children and young people have a very good physical recovery. And it's the hidden cognitive impact of an acquired brain injury that has some of the largest effects. And then we've already reflected on this, the fact that children and young people are also having to adapt to the fact that their brains are continuing to develop. And so their needs are changing or perhaps sometimes emerging over time. And things that might not have been so challenging for them before might become challenging in new ways as society or the environment or the kind of expectations that others have of them change. And if their brain then isn't developing in a way that we would expect typically for a young person of their age, if we don't get that support right, that brings the potential kind of challenges there. The other challenges that we have for them is attendance, integration, this idea that there's many hospital appointments, there might be lots of therapy appointments. If you've had a period of hospitalisation, then you've had a period out of learning, and so there's a need for these catch-ups. Potential then absences that are ongoing or missed lessons, and then how do you kind of keep up with the pace of that learning? And then, as I've already said, kind of that adapting to that new normal for them. And then the other challenge for them, I think, and what they will often say is that, sometimes they feel their needs aren't seen, or perhaps they're unrecognised, or that people have forgotten that they had an injury when they were in year 5 and they're now in year 9, and things are seeming quite hard, but people seem to have forgotten about that, and it was really significant for them. And there can be these other misinterpretations then that are had, particularly around some of the executive functioning difficulties, that organisation, the planning, the inhibition, kind of controlling our emotions, regulating ourselves, and the fatigue, the really significant fatigue that can look very variable, so from morning to afternoon or even within a lesson. And so you can see these kind of peaks and troughs in terms of young people's engagement, and making sense of that can be really challenging, not only for the young person, but I think also for those that are supporting them, to recognise that that's, it's having a really significant impact on them and how they engage with the curriculum. And the reason that it's really important that we get it right is because the evidence base has highlighted to us over and over again that actually, in the absence of the right support, the outcomes for children and young people with acquired brain injury are quite poor, both in terms of their attendance and their engagement with education, their overrepresentation within exclusion and alternative provision data, the impact upon, there's a huge prevalence of children and young people who are accessing the justice system either as young people or into adulthood who have had acquired brain injuries. And there's some really interesting work, if anybody's interested in that, done by Hugh Williams and the criminal justice groups within the UK Acquired Brain Injury Forum. We also know that it impacts upon jobs and qualifications and kind of future opportunities. There's a massive overrepresentation for young people with acquired brain injuries within all psychiatric conditions. There's also the risk of diagnostic overshadowing, so children and young people who've had acquired brain injuries who later acquire diagnoses of autism and ADHD, but have actually, it's almost like the history sometimes of the acquired brain injury has kind of been masked and lost, and we acquire other diagnoses. And sometimes that works well in terms of young people gaining access to the services that they need, but sometimes actually it is a very alternative provision that is actually required to be more specific to their particular development. And then finally, one of the biggest outcomes that many of our children and young people will talk to us about is the impact upon social adjustment and relationships, and their peers, time with their friends. And what we know is that there tends to be this real peak of young people kind of gathering around a young person after they've had such an event, but then over time those friendships and those relationships tail off, and children and young people feel increasingly isolated. But it's not all bleak, because when we do get it right, a really well-supported transition means that that increases the likelihood of young people staying within education, and it also, there's evidence to show it reduces the impacts in terms of use of services for both mental health and for social care, and people are more likely to enter into employment. We know that when there's been analysis that's been done of young people's goals, the priority goals for young people are often around school, understanding in school, and of friendship groups. And that when we get those kind of meet those goals and we provide kind of individualized approaches to support, children and young people have better outcomes and a much more positive participation experience, which in turn impacts on that identity, that sense of how we kind of adapt and understand the new me, whilst recognizing all of the strengths and the skills that we've always had, but being able to kind of then really build that self-esteem as we're building children's brains. And the reason that we're here today is because we're both really passionate in recognising that every single day schools build children's brains. That's what you do, it's what you do brilliantly, and it's the environment in which children have such a huge opportunity to learn. And rehabilitation is ideally, schools are perfect rehabilitation environments in terms of being able to provide children and young people with those opportunities to be able to make those connections to things they knew, finding new ways to be able to explore and to be able to learn, and also understanding how to access and utilize the support that might be around them. And for that reason, we know that these conversations, we're really grateful to you all being here, to be able to have these conversations for children and young people with acquired brain injury, and bring about that awareness and understanding is the first step in being able to think about what it looks like to get this right in the classroom. So we've prepared, there's a range of different resources that are available. So in terms of pathways that support young people in the return to education. So there's the ABI return, which Enables have produced, but there's also the Nottinghamshire Sam White ABI pathway. Essentially, the kind of crucial elements are about the importance of planning and preparation, so being ready for that young person coming back into school, awareness and understanding of that young person's acquired brain injury. What does it mean? How might it impact them? What do we need to think about for the future and ongoing development? The importance of communication with other professionals, accessing training, of which there's lots of freely available training from organisations such as the Child Brain Injury Trust and the Children's Trust. And then also you might be able to access that as well through NHS services, such as those that Emily and I work in, and then other kind of trauma centres throughout the country. Flexibility is the key. It's so important. We need to be dynamic in that response. How we place the young person at the centre of that, because they are adjusting to this new me, and listening to them and understanding where they are so we place interventions correctly, and thinking about how we support their participation and their inclusion. So on the next slide, you'll be able to see ABI Return has a range of resources in it. It has a guidance booklet, poster that can go up in a staff room, forms for basically helping you to support having conversations with the hospital, maybe sharing information that you know about that child from your school with them, and equally being able to help you to gather information from those professionals in order to support you in, as they return to school. There's also a range of case examples that have been provided by young people and their schools. And then mild traumatic brain injury, concussion. We're not going to talk about this for too long because we want to talk on the what works. But essentially, many people, as Emily said earlier, are often unaware that a concussion is a brain injury, a mild brain injury. And about 20 to 30% of those young people with concussion will experience those ongoing needs. And for some children and young people, those might last just for months, and for others, that might be for years. And what we also know is that if you were to have multiple kind of serial concussions, that can be particularly detrimental to that ongoing brain development. Many often have difficulties with fatigue or with kind of short-term memory or with headaches, particularly in the days and the weeks after concussion. And what we do have is a range of guidance from the Department for Education, which highlights the return to sport and return to PE. But what hasn't been available is actually guidance for return to the classroom, which happens first. So there's guidance here from the Child Brain Injury Trust, which is great for kind of supporting families and young people in those early stages in their return to normality. And then on the next slide, you can see that actually there's been concussion guidance that's been written specifically for supporting the return to transition to the classroom. So this is written specifically for kind of teachers and those supporting them within the education environment to understand what concussion is, what are the symptoms, what do they look like, and actually how do you support a graded return back into that learning environment.
Thanks, Gemma. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about how we can help and how we can support some of the difficulties that we see after ABI in the classroom. As we've said, there's a really broad kind of spectrum of needs that we do see. So we've pulled out some of the key areas and hopefully we'll give you some top tips about how to help support. So we're going to start with processing speed. Processing speed is really important to think about because when I spoke earlier about those networks that are developing in the brain, often after some kind of acquired brain injury, there is disruption or even kind of damage and permanent kind of damage to those networks in the brain. What that means is that when messages are being passed across the brain to the different areas and to make something happen, whether that's picking up a pen, whether that's shooting a goal in basketball, whether that's trying to learn something new, sometimes if those networks are not working how they should, those messages take longer to get to where they need to get to. So processing speed refers to how quickly a person can react to incoming information, understand it, and then think about that information, formulate a response and execute the response. So there's lots of different steps kind of involved in everything that we're doing day to day. And obviously, if you think about that road network that's being developed across the brain, any sort of disruption to that network can be very damaging to the speed that processing can happen. We sometimes talk about the networks in the brain as a sort of motorway. So across development, the road network with the clear motorways is developing. And when you want to go from A to B, you can travel quite quickly and efficiently. It doesn't use too much petrol if you're traveling on the motorway, and you get where you want to get to really kind of reasonably well. After a brain injury, it's a bit like there's a couple of the lanes closed or there's some sort of obstruction on the motorway, which means that you either have to go slower or you have to go the long way round to get to from A to B instead. The other impact of that is that you use more energy. So you would use more petrol in your car if you were driving on a motorway or having to go off onto an A road. And equally for young people, they're using more energy to process information as they go. So what we tend to see in the classroom is that these are young people who take longer to encode, to understand and use information. They may have trouble with things like reasoning and taking steps through information. They often get left behind and they may struggle to kind of follow instructions and keep up with the pace of the sort of teaching. What's really important to remember as well is that processing speed affects everything that a young person is doing. So we're not just talking about learning, we're not just talking about remembering, but we're also talking about those conversations that they're having in the playground. We're talking about the way that they're trying to get themselves between classrooms and so on. So it's impacting on their whole world. And that's where we feel like a lot of our young people are often saying, I feel like I'm always playing catch up with everybody else. So when we think about what can help there, the main thing that I always say to people is get rid of anything that isn't necessary for the learning that you want that child or young person to do. So if you're trying to teach about some sort of mathematical operations, then actually we want them to be really focused on the maths itself. If we give them a table to draw to then enter data into, a lot of that processing speed and that cognitive reserve that they've got available will actually go on drawing the table rather than focusing on the learning that's really key to the lesson. So if we can get rid of unnecessary or surplus tasks, that's a really good start. The old example that we always talk about as well is copying things down from the board. So the amount of processing that's involved for a child in having to look up at the board or the whiteboard or some sort of information, and then to look down look down to their paper, to remember what's been written on the board, to pick up their pen, to form the letters and to copy that. By the time they've started doing that, they've probably forgotten what they looked at in the first place. So that's quite a high demand task. So anytime that you're doing teaching or you're supporting a child or young person, think about what you can get rid of that really helps them to focus on the task at hand. Another thing that can be really helpful in terms of processing speed is just allowing regular breaks to allow their brain that time to catch up a little bit. So we talk about brain breaks, and we'll probably mention them quite a few times today, but brain breaks really are crucial for children and young people after brain injury. What it means is that it gives their brain time to not have to be working extra hard, because after a brain injury, brains are working that much harder because there is obstructions in the way, there is some sort of damage, there are networks that are disrupted. So we want them to have time to catch up, to regroup, and then to be ready for the next bit of learning or the next thing that's happening in their day. Obviously, when we're talking about older pupils, so we're talking about any student who's going into an exam or assessment type situation, we want to be thinking about making sure that there are time allowances for them. It's really important that that's also happening in any learning or homework. So sometimes it might be that for a pupil who's had a brain injury, we need to give them 4 questions to answer instead of 6 or something, just to account for that processing speed gap. Anytime we can also introduce really well understood routines and things like that, again, that takes the pressure off. It drops that cognitive load to a task a little bit, and making sure that teaching is paced really sort of gently, and we're checking in with the child as to whether they're keeping up, whether they've understood, and whether they know what we're doing. I think the other thing that we would say is that any opportunities that we can give them to have increased access to lesson content, so something around pre-learning, thinking about keywords, giving them handouts, things that they can review, repeat, and just have some of that information ready to go, can be really helpful as well. So moving on, when we talk about processing speed, often we will be thinking more generally about cognitive proficiency, so the ability of the brain to process and make sense of information in an efficient way. Grouped in with that is very much a kind of working memory picture, and many of you will know about working memory because it features in lots of other neurodevelopmental conditions such as dyslexia. So it's often something that's quite familiar for teachers to kind of manage, but I think it is really helpful to just regroup and think about the strategies that can be useful. So after a brain injury, we often do see difficulties with working memory. So that is holding information in mind for a short amount of time in order to manipulate or use it in some way. So listening to instructions, saying, open your book to page 5, go to the second paragraph and start thinking about the second sentence. That's kind of instructions that a young person with a brain injury may struggle to follow all aspects of. Things like mental maths is also a really kind of demanding working memory task, comprehension exercises as well. So classrooms are full of working memory tasks, and I think that it's really important that we're thinking about how we can kind of reduce the burden there as much as possible. Our young people that we work with also have difficulties with other aspects of memory. So they can have trouble with visual memory, so remembering things that they've seen visually, so places, pictures, diagrams, graphs, and so on. Or they may have difficulty with remembering verbal information that they've heard. So that might be instructions, that could be names or facts, and so on. And all of those things can have certain strategies that help to support them in the classroom. So in terms of working memory, what can help? The most important things to remember are to repeat information as much as possible, and to provide opportunities for pre-learning, for rehearsal, and for review. Wherever possible, what we also want to do is try and chunk that information. So our brains are much better at remembering bigger parts of information if we chunk it. So when we remember phone numbers, we tend to remember it as 07891, and then we do the next bit and we chunk the numbers together. If we tried to remember each digit individually, that would be much harder. The same goes for things like instructions. So if we can chunk information, give the young person information in small amounts, check that they've remembered and processed before we then give them the next bit of information, and that's really effective for them. Wherever possible, we also want to be breaking down tasks that are quite complex and making them simpler, giving clear step-by-step guidance within learning. and really thinking about what is a manageable amount for that young person. And again, we're going to reiterate that allowing them to have brain breaks is really, really important as well. Gives them that time to catch up, to process, to kind of lay down those memories that they need to. When we're thinking about visual and verbal memory, then again, I go back to the kind of recommendation about repeating information as much as possible and providing those opportunities for any sort of rehearsal, review as much as you can. But also what we try to do, because different the verbal and visual memory components of a task are held effectively within different parts of the brain, that's much clearer obviously as the brain develops, when the brain specializes more. But actually the more that we can provide information in a number of formats, the better for young people. So often if we show them something visually as well as giving them verbal information, we're targeting different parts of the brain, and then the linking up of that is much more effective, and the capacity that they have to remember is likely to be higher. So we might write down instructions, we might use verbal reminders as well, or use visual prompts, visual timetables, and so on. Another thing that can be helpful is trying to think about how you make the information meaningful to that young person. So what are they interested in? What do they already know? How can we really make that mean something? Because that adds extra layers to the memory, and it makes it much more likely that they can hook onto that and process it and encode it. The other thing that can be helpful is using recognition memory. So sometimes many of the children that we work with are very good at sort of taking in information initially, but sometimes they can't retrieve it very effectively. So if we can give them some sort of cue or prompt to help them to recall that information, that can be really useful. Finally, what I wanted to mention very quickly here is that for some children after a brain injury, the trial and error learning that we're trying to encourage them to kind of build skills in as they go through school can be very challenging. What we find is that they often remember their errors rather than remembering what they've learned through the process. What that means is that having a kind of error-reduced approach, we're very rarely errorless. We used to call it errorless learning, but it's not quite as straightforward as that. But reducing the number of errors in a process as much as possible can be really, really helpful after brain injury. So that might be, I always think about it as, you know, if you get a new mobile phone or something like that, rather than kind of scrolling through and guessing, you know, how you find the address book and put a name into it. What we want to do is we want to show them exactly how it should be done a number of times so that they learn the correct way to do that. And then we can start to take that scaffolding away once they know exactly how it should work. So you get your manual out, you follow the instructions 3 times, say, to get your person put into your address book, and you know exactly how to do it. You don't go every single time to a different app or a different bit of the phone that you don't need to go to. So that can be really helpful. There's lots of information about errorless learning online, and we can certainly direct you to other resources if that feels helpful. In terms of attention and concentration, I think this is one of the areas that many teachers and teaching assistants tell us they know more about. We see a lot of difficulties with children and young people with attention and concentration in the classroom. So we just wanted to kind of really quickly run through a few suggestions that we have. A lot of this is going to be really familiar to you, and many of these things are skills and strategies that you will already have. And I think from our perspective, it's just knowing that, you know, this young person has a brain injury. I'll pull out those out of my bag of sort of options, really. So what we tend to see in terms of attention and concentration in the classroom is that, you know, children can struggle to stick to a task for more than a few minutes. Many of the children that I work with, particularly early after brain injury, will only be able to stay on task for, you know, 5 to 10 minutes, sometimes less. And that will fluctuate as well throughout the day. So if they're fatigued, that will have a really big impact on their ability to attend. So there's lots of things going on for these children that may mean that they're on task 1 minute, but then very much not the next. And they often find it difficult to stay still, to stay in their seat. They may get distracted very easily. Sometimes that's internal distraction by pain or other things that might be happening for them. But that's also by external factors, such as things going on outside the classroom, other people who might be making noises, asking questions, and so on. And many of these children flip from one activity to another without fully engaging sometimes in the activity they need to do. So in terms of thinking about what helps then, wherever possible, we want to be removing distractions and trying to ensure that learning happens in as calm an environment as possible. Obviously, we recognise in schools that's very difficult, but I think, you know, I would often recommend to schools, if possible, that sometimes if a child is really struggling post brain injury, it is helpful to get them out of the classroom where it's really busy, noisy, there's lots going on, and just give them some opportunity for review of the things that they need to be learning in that calmer environment. Having breaks between activities, giving the child the chance to move around can be really helpful, and making sure that you have their attention when you're giving instructions. I think particularly, again, just knowing that a child in your class has a brain injury can be really helpful, because you know that you may need to just check in that little bit more, give them that opportunity for repetition. And I think as much as possible, getting them actively involved in a task, as you will know, can be really helpful. It helps them to stay tuned to that task much more. Another area that we often want to sort of share a bit of information with to schools is about executive functions. So executive functions are our higher level cognitive skills that help us to regulate our behaviour, to make decisions, and to set and achieve goals. These are skills, as we said, that are, you know, in some ways kind of focused in the frontal lobes of the brain, but also very much are directed by the networks that are developing across childhood and adolescence. So when we have damage to the frontal lobe, and when we have damage to those networks, we see really big disruptions to executive functions. And we have that protracted development as well. So the impact of those injuries may not be apparent until a young person has fully gone through their development, and until we can see all of those tasks that you can see at the bottom there in green. These are all things that are coming online across development. So really, when a child's had a brain injury, we want to be watching these different areas and thinking, have they met that milestone? Have they managed to, you know, show us that they can control their emotions, that they can sustain their attention, that they can think flexibly, and so on? And if they can't, we probably need to scaffold and support them a little bit more with doing that. So the sorts of things that you might see in the classroom, these young people can be disorganised, forgetful, they may have trouble getting started on tasks, they may not see things through, they get distracted very easily. They can get quite frustrated when routines are changed or expectations are not met, and they can act without kind of realising the consequences of those actions. So when we're thinking about helping, it can be really useful to start with really clear scaffolding about how skills need to be completed. And we can fade that over time as the young person learns these skills, but sometimes they do need to be learned in a really kind of matter-of-fact way, because they may not come naturally to them. So we want to allow them time to think, to plan, to set goals. We want them to then tick off those tasks in a slow, repetitive, step-by-step fashion, you know, letting them know kind of what they've completed, what the next step is, and so on. It's really helpful as well to help them think about alternatives when an initial plan doesn't work or they get stuck. They may find it really difficult to do that trial and error type learning, and they may find it really difficult to plan and problem solve when the way that they're going with something doesn't go as planned. In amongst all of that as well, we do see difficulties with disinhibition, with impulsivity, and so on, and outbursts of anger. So sometimes it's really helpful to give them space to think about other people's views, how we might manage situations, sometimes in quite a scripted way. I'll just talk very quickly about fatigue. So fatigue is something after a brain injury that we see in probably the large majority of our young people. So fatigue, or sometimes referred to as neurofatigue, is really common, and we can see it on cognitive levels, physical or emotional. But I would probably say we see physical fatigue much less than we see the cognitive and emotional side. What we find is that many children and young people get on a roller coaster ride with fatigue. So they have good days and they kind of think, yes, I feel all right, this is great. And they do lots. But then they have this big drop off where everything goes a bit wrong, and they really struggle to engage, to process, to learn, and, you know, to socialize and so on. So we have a big roller coaster. And what we want to do really over time is to try and help them to flatten that out a bit so that they are pacing themselves much more effectively. And what's really difficult with fatigue is that it interferes with school, but often children and young people get to school and they get through the day, and by the time they go home, they completely crash, and it really impacts on family life. It really impacts on social sort of situations, hobbies, and participation as well. So when we're planning around this, we want to be thinking about how we can make sure that the child's world and the world that they live in is kind of being considered, not just the education as a sort of isolated thing. So the sorts of things that you might see in terms of fatigue, they may look dazed or lost, they may drift off. A lot of children and young people start to look much paler. Some of them look a bit grey. They can yawn, but not always. They often have more difficulty regulating emotions and behaviour. You might notice that their handwriting goes off a bit. It starts to become untidy. They may not be able to produce language as clearly as well. And often they start to struggle to follow what's being said, take in information, show recall of kind of previously learned information and so on. So in terms of supporting fatigue, as I said, we want to work towards pacing as much as possible. That involves giving regular rest breaks and making sure that those breaks are paced throughout the day and that they are proactive and not reactive. If we give a break once we've noticed that the child is fatigued, we're probably a bit too late. So we really need to get in there early and say, we know that fatigue is a challenge for them. Let's plan in breaks throughout the day and make sure that we know we can keep them going as long as possible. It can be really helpful, I think, for schools and classrooms to observe and record those signs of fatigue that they do notice, and to kind of look at the patterns across the day and across the week as well. And we want to then gradually build on the baseline that we establish in that way. The last sort of bit of this section really is just thinking about emotions and behaviour and acquired brain injury. So we often do see changes in behaviour and emotions, and these can be temporary or they can be longer term. There's lots of reasons that we see these changes. You know, young people, children are responding to the trauma that they may have been through. They may be worried for their future and how things are looking and feeling very different for them. And they may be feeling quite different from their peers and trying to sort of make sense of changes in ability and appearance that they may have experienced. In addition to that, we can see changes in behaviour, in personality and in emotions because of the brain injury itself. So obviously damage to certain parts of the brain can impact on how a young person can regulate their emotions and behaviour. That's particularly around the frontal lobe, and we can see changes there. So we may see changes in how they engage. We may notice, I think, a lot of the young people I work with suffer from low self-esteem. We can see outbursts of frustration and anger, increased levels of anxiety, and then changes of personality in things like impulsivity and disinhibition and so on. So when we're thinking about how we can help with that in the classroom, I think you know, it's really important to take the time to talk to the child or young person and to the team as well about the potential triggers for perhaps any outbursts that you might notice or changes to behaviour and what might be reinforcing that as well. Having those conversations can mean that you can start to think about triggers and can we do something to reduce that so that we see less of this behaviour. Having clear boundaries is really important, and I think, you know, holding in mind the challenges that family have often been through when a child's had a brain injury. There's this sudden change of needs. They often report it as they're sort of suddenly trying to parent a child who isn't the child that they knew before. So it can be really difficult to have clear boundaries in that context, and also then to have those clear boundaries that match across school and home. But I think wherever possible, having those conversations and trying to facilitate that can be really useful. We want to take breaks away from the sources of frustration. We want to think about perhaps introducing some relaxation or grounding exercises. There's an example of the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding exercise there on the right of the slide. And at all that time, we want to be thinking about how fatigue might also be impacting on the kind of regulation that you're seeing. There are lots of really nice strategies for managing kind of and helping a young person to think about their behavioural regulation. We use zones of regulation a lot, and it's something I know a lot of schools are kind of seeing more and more. They're starting to use more and more in a school context. And in regard to brain injury, it can be really helpful because the red zone can very much be linked into that executive function side, and the blue zone to the sort of fatigue and other things that we might see. So that's something to explore a bit further, perhaps, if you're interested. And I'm just going to hand over to Gemma just to finish off today, talking about participation more generally.
Yeah, I just think, just to kind of conclude really, that, you know, the key thing that our young people and our families will often report is the impact of acquired brain injury on participation, and the importance of really thinking about how we promote those opportunities so that young people feel included, that they connect with themselves and that pre-injury identity, but also as they find new ways to be able to do things that they did before. And that might mean through adaptations, it might mean having support from your OTs, your physios, your speech and language therapists, alongside that, as you're discovering ways to kind of gain access to things within the curriculum, so that they're able to participate in a way that they've always done. And I think that's the crucial thing, really, just remembering them at the centre of this and everything that they've experienced, and connecting with themselves. And I think, just as a final note, really, we're acknowledging really that this is a really circular process. The importance of that communication, that you're not alone, when we hope you're not alone, and that there are lots of organisations out there as well, voluntary organisations and charities that we've mentioned today, who will also be there and available to support, as well as the range of professional teams that you've got around you, and the importance of that communication. The importance of getting that education, getting information about acquired brain injury through the sources of information that we shared today, and we've highlighted things like those free trainings that are available through voluntary organisations like Child Brain Injury Trust and the Children's Trust. We've talked about adaptations, the importance of, Emily's just done that in great depth. I guess the key thing for us is about the evolving nature of that, the importance of monitoring, responding to changes over time. No things are ever going to stay the same, and some things might emerge in the future. And so it's really important for our children and young people particularly to be considering that in terms of what those interventions need to look like over time. So our key takeaway messages really are, learning about acquired brain injury may well be new for you, but recognition is the key. And what we hope you've taken away from this today is the most of what works and the strategies that we've discussed are going to be things that are going to be very familiar to you. I think for us, our take home is always actually, sometimes it's the awareness, it's knowing that that child's had that injury in the first place, and that these are therefore the types of interventions that will help, because you build a new narrative around what you see within the classroom. Remembering that the interaction between different challenges post-acquired brain injury can exacerbate each other, and that the fluctuations that you see throughout the day or throughout their week are very normal and to be anticipated. And we acknowledge that that's challenging, so it's important to look after yourself too. Never, ever underestimate the impact of fatigue. I know Emily's just stressed that with all these interventions, but it is our big crucial one to think about. And as we said, remember that acquired brain injuries are dynamic, because children's brains are forever evolving and changing and growing. And it's really important to therefore monitor and support them over time. Thank you.